According to the United Nations, over 600 million people in Africa remain without access to energy, and more than 2 billion people worldwide rely on unsafe and polluting fuels and technologies for cooking. Then in enters an initiative led by the World Bank Group and the African Development Bank, Mission 300 or M300. It aims to shift the dial on the continent by connecting 300 million people to electricity in the next 5 years. To accelerate energy access through Mission 300, the World Bank Group will connect 250 million people to electricity, and the African Development Bank another 50 million by 2030. We look at the business of powering the continent now with Nchimunya Erlang Hamukoma, Manager of Energy and Opportunity at Global Energy Alliance. Thank you so much for your time on the Business of Africa podcast. Maybe let's start with an introduction of M300 to our listeners. You can definitely do a better job than I can, for sure.
Thanks so much, Dudu, and thank you so much for having me on the show. It's such a pleasure to be able to talk about this. So I think you've put in some of those statistics in terms of the 600 million Africans without access to energy. I think part of what helps to paint the picture is understanding that by 2023, the continent of Africa only had 246 gigawatts of installed generation capacity for a population of about 1.6 billion people. If we're looking at a comparative function with another country in the global south, perhaps we look at an opportunity like Brazil. Brazil, with a population of 212 million people, has 200 gigawatts of installed capacity. So there's a real dearth in terms of the energy access that's available on the continent. And there's a rule of thumb that I learned during my studies that helps to think about how much energy we need for large groups of people. And it's about 1 gigawatt per 1 million people. So in a context where we've got 1.6 billion people and only about 250 gigawatts, we have a real problem. And I think that's what Mission 300 steps in to do. It's an ambitious initiative to address Africa's energy poverty by providing access to 300 million people in sub-Saharan Africa by 2030, encompassing both on-grid and off-grid solutions. What makes Mission 300 so exciting is that it's actually breaking down silos. So instead of one individual group doing it by themselves, it's actually a combination of philanthropy, government, the private sector work together to deliver on this ambitious goal over the next 5 years to really fully connect 300 million Africans.
Thank you so much for that context. And as you mentioned, it is an ambitious goal. We've got quite a big continent in terms of countries. Are there regions of particular focus? How will energy be unlocked? More so when you speak of on-grid and off-grid solutions.
So in terms of the way that we're looking at, it's really country-led. So part of what we've learned working on the continent and in terms of development of the continent over the last few decades is that external solutions don't really solve problems. So Mission 300 really focuses on country-led delivery through national energy compacts. These national energy compacts are the core of Mission 300, and they're developed and endorsed by governments with technical support from development partners. Each of these country compacts is tailored to a country's context. They are practical blueprints that help to integrate on 3 core tracks, which is infrastructure, financing, and policy. And so each country will develop its own national compact that they sign in terms of how they see themselves being a part of Mission 300 and what works in terms of their local context. And then the development partners come in and help support countries to activate and to make those compacts into reality. In terms of where it's going to be, the first wave of compacts came from Chad, Cote d'Ivoire, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Liberia, Madagascar, Malawi, Mauritania, Niger, Nigeria, Senegal, Tanzania, and Zambia. And those were signed in Dar es Salaam. The next wave of compacts have come through from Climate Week at the end of September. So there's another wave of 15 more countries that have joined into the compact. So it really is country-led. And so countries that feel the need and are looking to provide energy access to their populations, this is really one of the best ways to do it. And that really leads where the work goes.
You mentioned a country like the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is also adversely affected by a lack of power, if you will. Ironically, it's got vast resources, of minerals that are critical for multiple clean energy technologies. And these are set to create new export markets. What opportunity is there for the continent to benefit before exporting?
There are so many opportunities because I think in terms of the continent's real benefit from this, part of what we're looking at is if we can create a stable, clear pipeline of demand, that there is real demand for energy, that these energy projects are going to happen, we're hoping that this project also does is help to stimulate the private sector and help to bring in private sector capital alongside MDB and government capital that's going into it. And when the private sector capital comes in, then local businesses have the opportunity to really thrive. So you have, in terms of from a sort of like large scale perspective, you've got the opportunity to increase the levels of beneficiation and mineral processing that's happening on the continent through clear pipelines and clear offtake in terms of where the energy needs to be and how we need to get it. So there's a sort of a really interesting large scale infrastructure play that's available here. And then at the smaller scale, at the SMME level, energy access is something that really unlocks economic opportunity for small businesses. And so there's a real opportunity around the productive use of energy to drive more local beneficiation and local results from energy access. And so that's how we're seeing it on both sides.
So I guess if we also had large off-takers where we're bringing value chains to the African continent, this kind of investment would make absolute sense, where we're not just looking at community level, but also to create jobs, right? We are the youngest continent in terms of population. And so young people need to also be stimulated by actually taking part in such initiatives.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I think so in my previous hat, I worked on youth employment, particularly on youth employment in South Africa. And the opportunity for youth employment through energy access is something that I'm incredibly passionate about, and something that actually we at GIAP, at the Global Energy Alliance, are also passionate about. Part of what we're looking at is to say, how do we stop energy being the end point? To say, okay, if we've given access to 300 million people, that's the end point. For us, we're saying, no, what about if we use that as the starting point to really look at how we can have greater economic activity in those regions and create more jobs through driving for a better productive use of energy? And so that's really something that we are quite passionate about delivering alongside these 300 million connections. Well, 300 million people connected.
Right. You spoke of attracting capital. What attracts capital, right? You spoke of also like having clear pipelines in terms of these specific countries that want to make this work. So what attracts capital?
I mean, I think some of the biggest attraction of capital is clarity and certainty. So if you understand the landscape and you know what's going to happen, then you can safely put your money there. I mean, I think even from like a household perspective, if you know that if I put my money in this bank account, I can get it when I need it, I can get some interest on it, I will be able to have it, you're much more likely to put your money there than to sort of just put your money on the side of the road and hope that something happens to it. And I think in terms of large scale capital, it's quite a similar process to a certain extent, is that if investors understand the context, they understand what's needed. So, and what's needed would then be sort of like the offtake. They understand where policy is going, where governments want to go, then that builds the confidence in terms of really being able to drive greater investment.
Fair enough.
I think what Mission 300 does is give that through the national compacts.
Fair enough. One can't imagine that this is also going to be a cheap exercise. What does the funding model look like? And is it country specific as well?
So I think it's quite mixed, and you're right. It's definitely not going to be a cheap exercise. But because it's not a cheap exercise, what's really interesting about Mission 300 is that it's the bringing together of so many different partners through radical collaboration. So some of the core actors that you see on the stage for Mission 300 are the World Bank, the African Development Bank, philanthropic partners such as the Rockefeller Foundation and ourselves, partners like SE for All. So there's a broad mix of funding that's coming through, and it's a range of concessional funding, multilateral funding, grants, catalytic capital. And then there's also the desire that this level of philanthropic and donor capital will help to spur on some of the more private sector capital to come in. In terms of what some of those numbers look like, the World Bank plans to double their spending on energy by 2030. So their focus of connecting 250 million people to electricity across the continent. And this will amount to about $30 billion for energy that will be spent between 2024 and 2030. And if we look at the African Development Bank on their side, their goal is to bring in the additional 50 million people. And I think those amounts come to about $6 billion from the African Development Bank.
Are there African players, or are there players within the African continent that are actually putting capital into the project?
Yes, we are absolutely seeing that there are people from the continent. And I also realize that I have to correct myself. the African Development Bank itself has committed $18 billion, and there's already been over $6 billion that's been announced by development partners for Mission 300. So I think if we see that the African Development Bank as an African institution is coming to the party quite strongly, that really does say a lot in terms about what we can hope to see through this process. And then in terms of African partners, a big goal is around bringing on African businesses. So there are initiatives like DARES in Nigeria that's looking to say, can we support local implementers and local businesses to drive in terms of the construction and the development of the energy access that we're looking to see. Mm-hmm. So it's definitely a localized solution that we're hoping for in Mission 300.
Maybe let's go a couple of steps back. At its most basic, what does energy access mean and what does it afford the continent?
Sure. I mean, so one of the things that really surprised me about starting to do this work was when we started to do field visits in terms of communities that have no energy access or limited energy access, is just how much we take electricity for granted. We were traveling and we were in a village in Nigeria, and one of the things that the community spoke about was that for the first time, they were able to have ice in the community and they were able to have cold water. And for me, that was just completely mind-boggling that there's millions of people who don't have regular access to cold water.
Maybe you can tell us more stories like that, like case studies where you go into spaces. Maybe you can clarify those for us because we are made to understand that the need as well when we speak about electricity access more so for people is in the rural areas. What are other stories that you are hearing and other examples that you can share with our listeners in terms of maybe farming as well? Because you've got smallholder farmers in the rural areas or subsistence farmers. How will this plug the gap?
Absolutely. And so I think this is exactly where the core of our work is. And at GIAP, we have a program called Productive Africa that's really looking at this quite specifically, in that energy access is basically how do we connect people to stable, affordable, and reliable electricity. And so what happens is that when you have access to stable, affordable, and reliable electricity, suddenly the options on the table start to change. So a big focus on our work is around energy access for farmers. And we're working with the MasterCard Foundation on a program called EWAS, which is Energizing Women and Youth Through Agriculture Services across the continent. We've got some really interesting projects around that in Nigeria and in Ethiopia. And what often some of the projects that we look at is to say, can we support farmers by bringing in irrigation pumps? One thing that we've seen in this work is that solar irrigation is one of the most efficient and really affordable ways for farmers to be able to get irrigation systems in communities where there isn't access to piped water, where there isn't access to electricity. And what energy access supported by productive use equipment does is that you then combine energy with its ability for it to be used effectively to generate income. So for farmers, this can look like connections to solar water pumps, which change their ability to irrigation. And so that means that they, instead of only farming in the rainy season, they can farm all year round. So if you have a family that was only able to get one harvest a year based on the rainy season or two harvests a year, you can see that increase to maybe 3 to 4 harvests a year, like literally multiplying the incomes of a family and a household, because now they can irrigate all year round. Some of the other innovations we see are around cold storage technologies. So, and you see this a lot, especially around fisheries, where, the quality of fish deteriorates significantly if you don't have it in cold storage. So even if you catch the freshest, most beautiful fish, if you're not storing it in either ice or in a fridge, if you leave that fish out for 8 hours, it's not looking good in terms of what you can get by selling that. But through some of the work that we're doing in Nigeria, we're looking at bringing cold storage solutions to communities where fishing is the main source of income. And by bringing them cold storage solutions, that means that when they catch a fish, they're able to get a much higher price for it at the market. They're able to not only sell the fish just to their local community, but to sell it to cities or areas that are further away from the waterways where there's a much higher demand for fish, and then get higher prices and better value back to the fish, back to the fisher people. And so I think that's one of the ways that energy changes things. I think it's quite so I live in Johannesburg, and one of the things that we discussed as friends over time was that, when we were having that intense load shedding, Joburg wasn't that fun. Like Joburg, it's not a fun city without electricity. Like
Sure.
we don't have the beach, we don't have those alternatives. When Joburg doesn't have electricity, it's traffic, it's stress, it's so many things that are disrupted in our lives. And so we have quite a high energy intensity lifestyle in Johannesburg. Whereas for a lot of the communities that are going to be affected by Mission 300, this is actually the first time that they're getting any kind of energy access. And so part of the work is to say, how can we support people to make the most out of energy access and to make the most in ways that can help them to increase the income of their families, to support their own livelihood outcomes. So it's things like, being able to study at night. If you were only able to study at candlelight before, but then you were able to get an electric light, that changes the quality and your ability to study and, the educational outcomes. If we're looking at healthcare centers, things that we know are really important is like in vaccines, the cold chain for vaccines are incredibly important for their efficacy. So if we can ensure that the vaccines are kept at the right temperature, we can do a really lot of work in terms of preventing harmful diseases through good quality vaccines. There's really a lot of applications for energy access and energy usage. And I think for us, our work is to say getting energy to people is one of the first steps in creating more economic and social dividends for communities. And so our work is to say, how do we create those economic and social dividends? Because just having electricity in an area doesn't make a difference unless people are able to use it effectively.
Absolutely.
And in order for people to use it effectively, it needs to be affordable. And they also need to have the appliances that use electricity and make your life better.
Fair enough. And so what kind of energy sources are being explored or are being rolled out? Because there is a big push to move away from fossil fuels to renewable energy. And then in enters also the question of sustainability, right? With renewable energy sources. What do we do in terms of, do they have a specific lifespan? What then happens after that, etc.? So I guess essentially the question is the energy sources that will be rolled out or are being rolled out and the issue of sustainability, how we balance the two.
Absolutely. I mean, so Mission 300 is looking at both on-grid and off-grid energy across. We are, as an organization, we focus primarily on renewable energy. Like that's where our work focuses. But Mission 300 does both on-grid and off-grid solutions. What we're finding, though, for many African countries, and especially because, Africa is really big. It's a very big place geographically. That often means that like the traditional model of connectivity through an on-grid solution with transmission networks that travel across can be incredibly expensive. And so we're finding that renewable energy, specifically distributed renewable energy solutions, can really help to access communities that are hard to reach. So distributed renewable energy solutions can look like household solar. It can look like mini grids in communities. So instead of having a grid that extends, instead of being connected to the main grid from like the main city 200 kilometers away, you'll have a mini grid where the town is able to generate its own energy for itself through solar. And so I think that's one of the things. And then also in terms of like solar and lifespan, this week I had the opportunity to be traveling in Mpumalanga, and I was on a site where somebody was showing me solar panels, and they were like, these solar panels have a lifespan of 25 years. Within the first 12 years, you have between 95 to 80% in terms of the usage, in terms of the efficacy. And then for the second half of the solar panel's life until 2025, you have another like 80% usage from those solar panels. So these long life cycles of solar panels are incredibly powerful, actually. So they are quite sustainable for the long run.
I hear your pup sounds quite grown as well, wants to be part of the conversation. He or she is more than welcome. So this is for everybody. It's a family show. So when we take a look at the project plan, right, in terms of tracking progress, do we check in another year? How do you track the progress for yourselves, right? Because 2030 is around the corner. That's in 5 years' time.
2030 is around the corner. So in terms of the monitoring and evaluation, there are some really smart and clever people at both the World Bank and the African Development Bank who are working really hard to develop sustainable models of measurement for this process. And so that is some of the work that's coming out in terms of, if we're going to be working in so many geographies, how do we measure this? How do we ensure that it has impact? And so there is a really strong monitoring process that is being developed by those partners as the sort of lead. And then I think in terms of like other partners, we're also working really closely with governments, because in terms of like the results is, for for many of the governments, they want to see this happen, and they really want to see, like, it's in the government's favor to be measuring and monitoring what's happening.
Yeah.
Because being able to provide energy access to your community, to your citizens, and to your populations is a key sort of driver for economic growth. And so I think we're going to get a lot of really good feedback from the from the compacts themselves and from the government partners.
Just in closing, Nchimunya, please remind us again of the power of this project.
Part of the core of this work and part of the power of this work is really thinking about the people at the end of the story. And so I think when we think about Mission 300, those 300 million Africans are just the beginning of this process. I had the privilege recently of being in Zambia and listening to President Hakainde Hichilema's opening speech for the opening of Parliament. And what he mentioned, which was so powerful, is that, like, you know, there are 600 million Africans at the moment who don't have access to power. Who are the 300 million left who say they want to be left behind? Nobody wants to be left behind of progress. Nobody wants to be left behind of this process. And so I think we have such a great opportunity as a continent to really get into something that could be quite revolutionary for the future of the continent. And so I think, like, the support of other nation states, like the interest from participants, like, this is really something that is for us, that is happening by us. And so this is something to really pull behind as a continent as we look to what the future of Africa really looks like.
And that is how we power up the continent. Thank you very much to Nchimunya Erlang Hamukoma, Manager of Energy and Opportunity at Global Energy Alliance.